Thank you, Stefan, for integrating me into this project, which, from my perspective, is kind of follow-up to my multiple previous experiences and engagements with Georgia and encounters with Georgia that are always pleasant and memorable. And partly, of course, it's also a product, but what I have submitted and what I'm going to present is also more analysis of more contemporary discourses and narratives on Georgia within Russia. So basically, I was using Russian language primary and secondary sources. And I think this is important because these narratives and discourses, they are generally meant for Russian consumption, for Russian domestic consumption. I didn't study those discourses that are meant for international consumption, but I do believe that they are not that drastically different from what I'm going to cover today. And I think there is a difference between, let's say, official sources and non-official, but still mainstream discourses in Russia. Because if you look at, let's say, strictly understood official discourses, well, they're very poor, they're very scarce, and there is, I mean, almost nothing to study because nothing happens in terms of policies. But if you look at a variety of, let's say, mainstream media discourses and think tanks discourses, you can get a better impression of what Russian mainstream speakers think about Georgia. And in the meantime, just one footnote. In Russia, it's very hard to draw a line between journalists and public policy experts. Sometimes think tankers, they play a role of just very similar to journalists, just sharing their opinions, which basically means one more challenge that I had to tackle. How to differentiate propaganda from more or less, let's say, not rational, but discourses that can be analyzed from the viewpoint of political science and international relations. Because when it comes to propaganda, it's very conspiratorial. And it's very little that we can do with that from the viewpoint of our discipline. But when it comes to discourses with a certain degree of rationality, of course, there are some interesting reference points in political science, like, for example, analogical reasoning. That's what I think Sonia mentioned from the very beginning. So kind of extrapolation of the previous experiences into more contemporary situation. Or, for example, spheres of influence. One of the major points in Russian discourse about post-Soviet space in general was space of influence or spheres of influence is a more or less established political concept. Or groupthink, for example, how people who are designing foreign policy can be wrong because of their, how shall I say, self-inflicted imprisonment in this, let's say, groupthink rationality. Okay, back to my contribution to the project. I have identified three different clusters of discourses, three different narratives that I think shape Russian understanding of Georgia and might also shape Russian policy, specific Russian policy. One is geopolitical, one is religious, and the third one, well, I would call it popular or vernacular, but I will talk about that a little bit later. So let me start with a set of geopolitical discourses that overtly place Georgia into much broader context of Moscow's relations with the West, and we know that these relations are chronically conflictual. And by the West, I mean basically the European Union and NATO, more specifically. And within this framework, Georgia is portrayed, first of all, as a country that is very much influenced by the West. And that's exactly what explains Georgia's disloyalty to Russia. You can find quite a lot of references to this kind of unloyal attitudes to Russia that have been displayed by Georgian elites. And this disloyalty, I'm just trying to rebuild or reconstruct the logic of Russian discourse, taking it quite neutrally, as we should do. And this sense of disloyalty creates a kind of insecurity for Russia, not because of Georgia as such, but because, again, the argument says, or the argument averts that Georgia allows non-regional powers to use Georgia in their own interest. And the concept of non-regional powers is quite well embedded in Russian international discourses in general. Well, in this specific case, of course, again, what is meant is either the European Union or NATO or the United States more specifically. And when it comes to the US role in the Georgian politics, I have it as just one of the episodes of my study. That's what I would call a biosecuritization of Georgia. And the focal point is a research laboratory, the so-called Louvre Center, created in Georgia with the assistance of American partners. And in the Russian media, there was quite a hysterical reaction to this laboratory with multiple stories in, I mean, both verbal and visual in major Russian TV channels, claiming that this is just one of the elements of US created centers in other post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine, including Kazakhstan, that allegedly, in the Russian interpretation, are aimed at developing biological weapons that might be used against Russia. And here we have a whole bunch of conspiratorial type of thinking, up to the point of creating ethno-specific weaponry that allegedly might kill only people with Russian or generally Slavic background. So I use this as a very much telling and illustrative case of securitization of a small country with this biological, how shall I say, biological notes or tones in it. Another interesting point in Russian geopolitical discourse is that Russia is trying to claim or reclaim its special role in Georgia by referring to the fact that Russian peacekeeping mission was deployed in the territory of Georgia in 1990s, when international organizations were much more reluctant to provide some kind of military or security assistance to Georgia. Russia was trying to portray its role, at least in the 1990s, as a honest broker, very oftenly referring to the fact that from 1998 to 2008, Moscow imposed its sanctions against Abkhazia. Then we can easily find multiple references to the mission of Evgeny Primakov, who mediated between Ardzinba and Shevardnadze in 97, and then Igor Ivanov playing a similar role a few years later when it came to kind of negotiations concerning removing Abashidze from his position in Adjara. So Russia is playing with this argument of allegedly having a particular role to play in Georgian politics, and in the meantime, what remains in the shadow, or which intentionally is sidelined in Russian discourse, is that in fact, in parallel to what I have mentioned earlier, in fact, Russia is just exploring some vulnerabilities of Georgian politics, of course, in combination with projecting military power. And I also have some arguments supporting this this point. By the way, I also touch upon the so-called Gavrilov incident, which was largely portrayed in the Russian mainstream narrative as unfriendly provocation, a Russophobic provocation, allegedly directly inspired not only by a certain part of the Georgian political elite, but also by Georgia's foreign partners, including, of course, NATO and the European Union. So this type of conspiratorial thinking, that's my point, is always cropping up when it comes to specific incidents in Russian-Georgian relations. So summing up this geopolitical cluster, the major argument is that Russia is trying to resignify, to reconceptualize its role, including its imperial heritage, as allegedly protective and more creating opportunities for Georgia as for other nations, and more inclusive rather than detrimental. Another geopolitical argument that Georgia could have avoided losing territories should it opt for keeping closer relations with Moscow and refraining from unduly irritating the Kremlin. I think this is also part of the Georgian discourse as well. Then, of course, this very critical attitude to the Saakashvili regime is very much a part of that in the Russian narrative is kind of counterbalanced with an alternative way of dealing with Moscow, which would be more depoliticized, like business as usual, and that's exactly what Russia would support. And in the Russian narrative, there is always a major reference points, which is Eurasian project, which is portrayed as a region in the making, that of course is not confined to Russia. And the allusions are that Georgian European choice is more like utopian narrative of so-called bright future that might not be implemented duly. So that's a major point of this geopolitical narrative. So when it comes to the second cluster, religious narrative, well, I think it's well known, and I will be very short, very brief. Georgia is portrayed here in a very different way as a member of a global Orthodox community, sharing conservative values and traditionalist approaches to national identity as either an alternative or something which is incompatible with the Western liberalism, including such sensitive issues as minority protection, multiculturalism, sexual emancipation, and all these very well-known elements of discourse. So I think the idea of incompatibility of the so-called traditional Orthodox values with the liberal agenda of the European Union seems to be central for Russian religious narratives. Of course, it's very conservative rhetoric, the rhetoric that is ultimately ends up blaming the West of imposing undue and, let's say, alien emancipatory lifestyles in the Georgian society. And again, this background, of course, Russia is portrayed as a protector of Orthodox identity, again, which is an alternative to the West. And of course, in the brackets, I should also mention that some high-ranking clergy in the Georgian Orthodox Church also seem to buy this discourse and seem to be quite supportive of this type of let's say Eurosceptic or anti-Western narratives. And as a political repercussion of that, this also well-known thing is that Russian Orthodox Church many times stressed that both Abkhazia and South Ossetia continue to fall under the jurisdiction, the canonical jurisdiction of the Georgian Orthodox Church. I do know that the situation on the ground is much more complex, but since I'm not dealing with policies and mainly with discourses, I will not touch upon this this issue.
3 minutes, Andrey.
Yeah, and finally, what I would call popular representations of Georgia. This is something which is relatively new, and I used as a primary source for my analysis a dozen or even more than a dozen of video blogs about Georgia, created and made by Russian travelers, unprofessional and professional. And I think this is a kind of erasing segment in Russian, let's say, vernacular, popular discourses about this country that is drastically different from both geopolitical and religious discourse. Georgia is presented as a friendly country with no single traces of what in the official discourse is known as Russophobia. It's a perfect place of holiday destination. It's attractive and hospitable country, which is worthwhile for visiting and for seasonal sightseeing. And what I found interesting in these visualized narratives about Georgia is that many of the blog makers and many of these video bloggers, they claim that this is the real Georgia, not a Georgia that you can see from the first channel, from Russian Foreign Ministry discourse, but this is real Georgia. And this is a type of, on the one hand, non-political or depoliticized narrative, but in the meantime, it's also inherently very political, because it creates an alternative to securitized official mainstream discourse. And I think for, let's say, understanding what the Russian society thinks about Georgia, we definitely need to keep an eye on this growing segment of Russian visual representations of Georgia that, again, I think makes sense from political perspective as well.